finish up with public comments that need to be addressed. Not seeing anything, okay?
Do you mind if I address it?
Please.
Good evening, everybody, by the way. Good to see all of you. We are interested in trying to better accommodate those periods of time when council would like to remove an item from consent and bring further discussion to bear on whatever item that might be. I get really nervous when we talk about suspending the rules and moving in a direction of that nature, and would rather put together some scripting or whatever that would allow us that opportunity to move in the direction of discussing something on consent in a little more detail. One of the things that, there's a couple ways we can go, actually. One of the things that helps from sort of a planning and logistics standpoint would be if we could get some sort of heads up prior to the meeting that would allow us to script the agenda accordingly and maybe even put together some information that we could use to help answer those questions. That of course would be ideal, and I recognize, however, that it's not always a luxury that we have in terms of anticipating those questions or understanding those issues may be of question. And so in that regard as well, what we would suggest is maybe at the very beginning of the meeting, having the mayor address the question of, do we anticipate anything needing to be pulled from consent, right at the very beginning. Or we can take the Robert's Rule type scripting that's provided through that mechanism and just plug it in right in front of the consent agenda portion of the script agenda, and just have it always there in the event that indeed a consent item needs to be pulled and something needs to be addressed separately. That way we can just follow right down the path that Robert's Rules would provide, and not have to bring up the, introduce the specter of, we're going to suspend rules tonight, kind of a thing. Got a lot of ways we can consider it.
Steve?
I thought from when I was on council before that basically we get the agenda and the packet on Friday, and if we called in by noon on Monday, all we had to do was request it to be removed, and then that took care of the exact situation you're talking about. Now I realize that cuts, for those that push the limit, that cuts them about a day and a little bit short, but I thought that was supposed to be the procedure for removing things from consent.
Right?
Yeah, I agree that I think we need to be following something a little bit more. If it's off the cuff, we're pushing that. But I think more to that point, what Steve is saying, I think it's critical that, and I know it's difficult depending upon how busy you are, it's critical to go over your packet and to read through those things. And then if you do have questions, to be able to call ahead or to do those things is really critical. And I know that some things just happen at spur of the moment, sure. But I just would make sure that people are reading their packets and going through so they're ready and prepared by Tuesday. It would be my suggestion.
Mike?
That's kind of was my understanding too. I will simply confess, last week I had not done my homework that far ahead of time. Sure. And I saw that on there, and then I had kind of wanted to mention that, well, in our pre-meeting, but the pre-meeting kind of went on and everything, and then we got in there, and I almost didn't bring it up when I did, but then I did, and I'm kind of glad that I did bring that up.
Well, I was going to say, Mike, that the fact that we all had something to say after you brought it up means a number of us should have suggested that ahead of time.
Yeah, but though, any kind of a procedure that, that we notify the mayor, whether if it's in the pre-meeting or, something. But yeah, I absolutely agree, because it just, if the rule is that we suspend the rules, then why do we have rules?
Well, the thing I want to own is when we do the agenda review, sometimes we're a little careless with that. And as mayor, I really think it's my responsibility to stop and say, let's take a look at the consent agenda. let's look through it right now and make sure that everybody's good with it, because sometimes something will pop up right then if we all take the time, because that's the point of the agenda review, is to make sure that we see things ahead of time so we can make those changes. But we kind of light duty that, and maybe we should focus on it a little more clearly. Steve, did you have something? Somebody else? Bob?
Yeah, I concur. It's probably, I know we used to try and work by that Friday rule, but that puts your staff under a lot of pressure to make sure the package is out in time. And I know there's been times we just couldn't do that. And so I think perhaps putting something in the rules or something that Charlie reads up front with a notification in the pre-meeting that, hey, I'd like to pull item 16A5 or whatever.
But better if we do it a week prior, because
Yeah.
we could do that tonight. For next Tuesday's meeting, is look at the agenda, it's all right there for us, and see if anything pops up. And then we can fix it right now, rather than wait until a couple days before the meeting. So did you have something?
Yeah, I agree, but I do like the idea of having the script prior to the consent, because as we have had, you know, people bring stuff up to us and it's on the consent and we decide to change it. I think having just a script prior to the consent, whether we use it or we don't, I think it's a good idea to have that for that purpose. My opinion.
The only thing about last week's meeting that I want to add is, based on our 2-minute conversation about the Moneta divide, and you're all advising me to go down and argue for economic development if it's determined to be a safe development. I am now the world's biggest fan of pollution.
Mm-hmm.
And social media has identified me as such. And I have gotten emails, and you know, of course, nobody's paid attention to what we actually said. It's just, you know, the reinterpretations that go on. So such is life. So, and I will also say that part of the context of that is that our Department of Environmental Quality went through a very extensive review of the proposals, just so you're all aware, and they came to the conclusion that several of these proposals could be done without significant environmental damage, and then they started getting some pressure from the federal government regarding, did they make the right call on that? And so part of it is, we should trust our own people. They know what they're doing, they're professionals, and they believe that, and we should be taking care of our own affairs. It's just my take on it. So, anyway, anything else on last week? Then let's move on to the straw poll. I'm sorry.
I just have a real quick question in moving on to the next two items. For the salary and the term length, item number 3, are we trying to put that in for this next year?
I think the term length was really just was a clarification, was it not?
Mr. Mayor.
Of what our ordinance says.
I think that's all it was, because we had found some language in the statutes that caused us some pause, and with the attorney's review, which he's prepared to give this evening, we don't have as much concern.
I mean, we could reverse those things if you would like, because I could see how someone being newly elected would feel uncomfortable about voting for the increase.
And that's the only thing that I'm bringing up, is that no matter who is picked as being the next mayor, I think that maybe we should take care of that ahead of time while it is the way it is, and then we could do that election afterwards.
So you're all familiar with the argument I made, that there are some costs associated with it in terms of extra time and, you know, miles driven, et cetera. Comments on whether we should go to the state allowed maximum of $300 per meeting versus $200. I think Ray was first and then Mike.
Yeah, I'm gonna support it, and I think we should move it to the state maximum allowed, just because I agreed with you, Charlie. The year that I served as mayor was, you know, a time of, it was pretty busy, and I think that the extra compensation is good. It's not overly exorbitant. It's not like we're giving $1,000 a month, you know, pay raise or anything like that. I think it's well within. It's a conservative bump for the mayor, for the work and the time that the mayor does put in outside of their, not only their family, but work as well. So I'm all in favor for it, and I'm hoping everybody else will support it too.
again, one of my arguments is it makes it a little more likely, not a lot more likely, a little more likely that we can kind of address the demographic challenges of the council, where people in my age group are in a position to do this, people your age group, it's hard. And so maybe just a little bit to defray those sacrifices that people do. Other comments, Mike?
Well, I'm all in favor of it, but, you know, I am firmly convinced that that's just a token reward for the extra work that you put in.
It's not dollar for dollar.
Yeah, I don't think anybody's gonna, oh goody, I get that much more, but, you know, still, a nice little token recognition is a nice thing. What I'd be concerned about at this point, though, is if we can get that passed this year so that it would reward whoever the mayor is next year. And do we have an opinion on that? I noticed that.
We could implement this for next year, could we not, John?
If we can get 3 readings in.
Oh, that's right, we gotta get.
So, I think that they're anticipating that you can get 3 readings, and we were looking at it, I think there's gonna be a special meeting called just to make sure we get 3 readings.
Ah, okay, so we could do that at the front of a work session, okay.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I agree.
Yeah, it's,
Just double checking, and if you mind. Does it matter, whether it's, I thought that was for cities that is mayor-led, not with a city manager that runs and, I'm not sure if I'm saying it right, but I thought that would, is it for any mayor, or is it, I thought it was to cities that the city is ran by mayor alone that makes a decision, so
Yeah.
I'm not understanding.
Yeah, actually, there's 2 provisions. One's a constitutional provision, which seems to apply broadly to any elected official, but there is a specific provision in the mayoral form of government, though it's in that section of the statute, but it's worded very broadly, so it looks like it would even apply to us, even though it's in the section for mayor-run forms of council and city government. So, based on those 2 things, I think you have to say we need to get this done this year if we're going to have a change from the new mayor's term coming in 2020.
And the mayors that have the more traditional form of government are paid as an actual salary. Not a large salary, but obviously a lot more than, with the stipend that we get. Any other comments? Anybody have any objections to moving forward with this? Thumbs up on getting started with this process? Okay. All right. Okay, now we can go to the straw poll. Now, Carter and I had a discussion in
Did
between.
you want to talk about the term limit?
Yep. Can we-
Oh, I think we did.
Nope.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
John, address that a little bit?
I tell you, at the last work session we had, I was looking at the statute, and the statute says 2-year terms for a year, basically. We went back through, and actually Amanda with Fleur's office tracked down an old resolution. Actually, she tracked down it's important, an old charter ordinance. I didn't even know we had any charter ordinances in the city of Casper. And it provided that, in fact, we will have a new mayor every year. And so therefore, the term would change every year. That's why we're able to modify this. And so we were happy to make that distinction, and I give all the credit in the world to Amanda.
Thank you, Amanda. I think we can thank a mayor, unnamed mayor in the late 90s who must have really ticked off the council and caused them to pass a charter ordinance as they completed their first year to say, no, you're not going to be the mayor for another year. So there's a story behind it. Okay.
Well, but Mr. Mayor, do I understand that precludes the council from just electing a mayor 2 times in a row?
No, we've done that.
Yeah.
I don't think we can preclude that.
Okay, so we could do that, but we couldn't say, you're the mayor for the next 2 years.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Without changing the ordinance.
Yeah, yeah. I might have been the only guy.
Janine was mayor for 2 years.
Yeah, we was,
Paul Meyer was vice mayor.
And I was mayor next year for 6 hours. Until Amanda
That's
found
right.
that, until Amanda found that ordinance, so, okay. Any other questions about term limits or the compensation? Really not salary so much as stipend, I think would be the right word, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
But, okay. Okay, on to the straw poll then. Carter wasn't here when we had the last, I don't think, when we had the last election where we had more than 2 people nominated. And so what I recall, and correct me if I'm wrong, because we have to decide how we're gonna do this. And there's no rules, there's nothing written down, there's just traditions. But I think what we did last time when we had 3 candidates is there was a straw poll, and then the 2 top vote getters had a runoff. Is that what you all recall?
Yes.
Okay, rather than just the highest vote getter on the first vote.
Okay, so just 2 sets of voting?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so,
I didn't know what runoff meant, sorry.
so let's see, how,
Like, race?
should have prepared for this a little
I'm
better.
very slow.
You got it all figured out, Fleur? I should have known. Can you guide us through it, Fleur?
Sure. So we have ballots with the 3 names for everyone, and then we'll go back and count, and we can do it either way. We can do the top 2, and then go back around. We prepared to do it, last time we actually just did the top vote getter. We didn't do a second round of voting. We
Well, there were only 2 though last time.
There was 3 for vice mayor.
Oh, okay, okay.
So we just did the top vote getter. We didn't go back around. We do have other forms for people to fill out if you want to do a second round. So-
How would you like to do both of them that way with 2 votes?
So 2 rounds?
Yeah.
Charlie? Okay.
For each,
For each
Well,
position?
Unless if one person if one person clearly gets a super majority on the first round, do we have to then?
If you had a 5-2-2,
Then just pick, I
No,
see,
but-
so we'd only have the runoff if there is not one candidate that gets a majority of votes. Does that sound good?
and we're defining it as 5.
Yeah,
Okay.
and then we'll do both positions the same way. Okay? All right, then let's go ahead.
Thank you, ma'am.
Don't we need music for this?
Got my pen again.
Jeopardy music. I mean, I'm sure we could pull something up.
Pens all disappeared.
They're all gone, yeah.
the theme from Jaws.
That's probably just as fitting.
Absolutely.
No, I need my little ballot box.
Yes.
Thank you.
Nothing to think from Jaws.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Write-in candidate.
I saw him, he wrote Trump in.
Oh, they'd be so excited. I voted
That's
for,
okay, I voted for Nancy.
great. I voted for Connie.
We had the outgoing,
I think that's John's job.
we had the
Which
outgoing
one?
mayor
Schiff.
and
Oh.
the
Yeah.
city attorney count the
Adam
ballots.
Schiff, isn't
Okay. That is.
Isn't that right, Ray? Didn't we have the outgoing mayor and the city attorney count the ballots?
Yes, yeah, the outgoing mayor goes.
Oh, okay, never mind. I do know who that is. Okay. I was like, the name sounds familiar. I was like, but I don't know where I know that.
You guys go ahead. You guys, are you okay with these guys?
I've seen that.
Lean.
Go ahead, that's fine.
Do it.
And we'll have.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I heard you, yeah.
Lean.
Chicken shit.
Oh, gosh.
Thank you.
They'll always come up with something.
Yeah, it's just.
That is interesting.
I think it's been funny too, is Trump's numbers are going up.
Oh, you're.
No, it won't be long.
That's real sassy.
She was pretty quick last year.
Simon his deal
I
with
mean,
Iran
Yeah.
in terms of 1.8 billion. I mean, you can,
Well, but it's not you can. There's nothing wrong with a quid pro quo. There is a federal statute that says that it is a violation of federal law to try to obtain help from any foreign entity in
bottom
a
part of their
domestic
parking lot, like,
election.
and there's that little hill that goes up
And
to
they lost,
stuff like
well,
that, like whatever.
one
Basically
side
Casper Mountain Road
has
and
successfully
whatever that is.
distracted this
So,
whole thing.
There's all these cars backed up, there's all these cars backed up this way, and there's this poor girl in like a Ford Fiesta, and she's just spinning, like she's completely stuck. And everyone's literally just sitting in their cars, just watching. Because I guess like they just think that if they watch, she'll somehow get out. So no, of course, it was being dramatic. So I put my car, I park it, put my hazards on, I throw my hands, and I get off and I push it like that's a hill. But the first thing I someone's gonna get a picture. Where I'm like hunched over this car, looking like a marshmallow, like pushing her. It didn't, I haven't seen anything, so I think we're safe. But of course, I was like, I'm sure like my dress is tucked in somewhere, should we tuck it?
Floor's ready.
Alrighty. Okay. There was super majority, so 5 votes for Frill.
For who?
Steve Frill.
Okay.
Good. Steve who?
No, I didn't even hear the Steve.
I didn't say Steve actually. I just Steve.
Okay.
Oh, okay, that's me.
So what should we do with vice?
Yes.
Will you serve?
What's that?
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is that everyone?
No, what I was getting at was, is it really to influence an election? Or is he trying to go through and look
No,
at the
I literally
corruption?
pushed this car up the hill by
Because how
myself while everyone sat in their
corrupt
cars and
was
watched. In a dress
for-
and snow boots. No
That's the
joke.
argument that
No
he
joke.
made.
I was
Do it.
shocked.
That's the argument that Trump can make.
I don't know what everyone
Yeah,
was thinking was
but,
gonna happen, that they were just
you know,
gonna
he
sit and
didn't
watch her, she
say
was somehow miraculously gonna make it up this
all
hill.
of the alleged
Like,
corruption.
you're just gonna sit in your car all day.
Driving around the road.
Well, she kept swerving side to
Zeroed in
side, so they couldn't go around her.
On that.
I mean,
That would
a
be
Ford Fiesta
my
is about
argument.
as much as I do, so it's
Right.
pretty easy to push up a hill, but like.
When they're fixing to investigate
It's not like
the
I had
guy,
to do anything of like
and then the vice
difficult.
president tells the Ukrainian president to fire the prosecutor,
That was not,
to me, that's the corruption.
but though, looking at, and looking at in 2016, he violated that, Trump violated that same statute when he sat there and said, I hope the Russians can find these lost emails.
Full
He's
blown Wyoming
asking
this morning, no, I literally had to
foreign
clean off my
entities
car with a broom,
to help
like
him in
a
the
shop broom.
election.
I tried using like my little
Well,
scraper cleaner thing, but it was literally like
whatever.
10 inches deep on my car. I was
That
like,
is
this
a
isn't gonna work.
black and white
So I just took the shop broom and scraped up.
When you or I, running for the
Big,
Casper City
foam
Council, we went
rectangle on the end of it
to a
with a
foreign
big
entity and said, I want you to help me.
No.
Like,
That's
those
the
are nice.
problem.
You just grab the top.
Because, you know, it's.
I might need to invest in that.
Are you ready, Fleur?
I'm sure my neighbors were.
Okay, we've got an announcement here,
Perplexed.
folks.
Councilmember Roots.
Oh.
Wow.
Okay, on we go. Okay, is there any other discussion about that process? We go on to the Wyoming Business Council grant.
Mr. Mayor, members of the council, we would like to take an approach to the Business Council for some funding with regard to some improvements that we would want to pursue in the downtown area adjacent to the river. And so we'd like to have you consider this proposal and potentially give your blessing with respect to our submitting an application, which typically requires a resolution as well, and those kinds of things pursuant to a public hearing and whatnot. But if I could defer this discussion to Jolene to walk us through, I would appreciate that.
Ready, Jolene? Great, thank you.
Mayor, Council, we're calling it the First Street Gateway Project, and it's in essence a trail park along the riverfront. You'll see we finished B Street, goes into a parking lot and a boat ramp down to the river. The trail would have like bollards, picnic tables, and somewhere in here there would be a welcome to Casper sign as the gateway. It's thought that perhaps that could be some kind of bronze or art. That has not been decided. That would be up to council as we move forward. But we would like to submit a grant to the Wyoming Business Council to fund part of this. The total cost is estimated to be about $786,000. We require a 25% match. We're also proposing some other grants that be used for the match. I have been in, well, several of us have been in discussions with some foundations in Casper about funding pieces of the entire project, and we feel confident that we would be able to get the match money to be able to do this trail riverfront park. And don't get me wrong, the park is basically a trail park with the boat ramp, and that gives access right into the river. So you don't see any huge park, it's basically the trail is the park.
Questions for Jolene? We own this land.
Mayor, Council, we are in talks with the Platte River Trails Trust to acquire this property over here because with the Wyoming Business Council grant, we would have to own the property, and we would need to look at acquiring this property here.
So the trust has all of it right now?
No, this
I'm
is
sorry.
privately
Oh, I'm
owned.
sorry. Wasn't listening, okay. Other questions for Jolene, Steve?
Does the $750 include the purchase of the land south of First Street?
Yes, Mayor, Council, yes, it does.
Okay. Steve, follow?
Is there a boat ramp, or isn't there a boat ramp or a launch down to the west of Poplar, off of First Street, down by where the Whitewater Park and things like that are?
There, Mayor, Council, some people might say that there is, but there really is not. It's far too dangerous, and it really is, it's just kind of a dirt path down into the river. Over by the Tate Pump House, there is a takeout and not really an official boat ramp either. We're trying to give access to all users. You have to be very skilled to use these boat ramp entrances. They're not really even ramps, just these takeouts. So, like the one that we did in Murad Park, it's wide enough, it's for all users, whether you're good at backing a pickup with the trailer on it or not, you can use the boat ramp. The other thing that this would provide, Mayor and Council, which we haven't discussed, is a way for the fire department to access the river. Right now, for the fire department to access the river for any water rescue, they need to go all the way out to North Casper to Riverview Park and put in there, and that's their only access, or Murad Park at this point. So not only would this provide access for our citizens, it would also provide easy access for our fire department to do water rescue.
Ken?
How many parking spaces are we looking at right there?
Mayor and Council, I'm going to ask Andrew Beamer to.
Mayor, Council, it has not been designed yet, but I would envision maybe a dozen, perhaps, something.
Jolene, will there be any connectivity with the other trails?
Mayor, Council, yes. there's already an existing trail right in here. We are moving it closer to the river, and it's outlining wetlands. So we're not moving it into the wetlands, it's right on the edge of the wetlands, and this trail is in poor condition and it needs some maintenance. So we're replacing the trail here, and then this will go right into a trail here. It will end, we can move this up a little bit so I can. It ends right at property line. This is BP Amico. The hope would be someday that we could acquire a right-of-way or property through here to connect over to the trail and go into the master plan with the Trails Trust. So in essence, the first phase, if you will, but we're not calling it a phase, would end at this property line at this time.
Bob?
Is this contingent on any other property exchanges, or the price is fixed for the property that we're gonna have to buy?
Mayor, council, the prices are not fixed on this. We still have negotiating to do on the price here, and it's not contingent on any trade of any kind. It's contingent on the price that we negotiate.
And the trust is, I assume, on board with this, Jolene, the Platte River
Mayor,
Trust?
council, we have been working with them on this. They would like to see that trail replaced. We have, as part of the agreement, we have agreed to replace the trail, as part of the project overall. Does that answer your question?
Yes. Steve?
The underpass there at First Street, is there room already under that bridge, or is that gonna be major work to get across First Street?
Mayor, council, I'm trying to remember. Andrew, do you remember?
America, that path exists now, so
Yep.
there's room now.
Okay.
That's the one where you come down the ramp and then turn onto the trail.
Yeah.
Well, what's your pleasure, council? My only concern, and it's not really a concern, but it's just something we should always be aware of, is that the Wyoming Business Council seems to have a way where they tally requests by community. And so when we make a proposal or a grant request, somehow that seems to affect a later request for something else because Casper already got something. So I'm not arguing against it because this is great, but I just think we should be mindful. There's only so many times we can go to the well on this.
No, it was the Business Council that turned down our Midwest Avenue extension.
No, that was federal. The grant we lost was on the First Street Reach. Right, Jolene?
Mayor, council, yes, and when we went down and talked to SLIB, this was what we were basically asking for, but the grant was apparently not written clearly enough for them to understand, and at that point, SLIB asked the Business Council if they would reconsider if we brought another proposal, and they are actually expecting us to bring a proposal back as a SLIB, so to make this clear and understand it.
Bob?
Mr. Mayor, thank you. I continue to support us acquiring property along the riverbank. In the long run, it's just good for the city to own any property we can acquire at any reasonable price. I think in the long run, it'll be a good thing for us.
Jolene, this one in any way, us having ownership of this impact the restoration project of the river itself? We don't need this, we don't need to own this to continue the work.
Mayor, council, we don't need to own it to continue the work. And I guess I'm also going to call on Andrew to talk about this at any point too. We don't need to own it to continue the work. It is in the best interest of the city, though, to be able to maintain and to give public access. We've worked very, very hard on this river reach. It's been very expensive. It's been 5 years in the making or more. And for us not to have access, or our citizens actually, to have access to some great fishing, to a river right in the core of downtown, I don't think works in the city's best interest for our citizens.
Other questions, comments? As long as you're talking about the project, can you give us a status report on how things have gone the last several weeks?
Mayor, council, we have not had any releases the last several weeks, which is a very good thing. They have finished, the river left, and you saw perhaps they flopped the berm, and we have now isolated river right, and they are now working on the river right side. So things seem to be going well. It still will be a 2-season. We are going to have to end, and we will likely only get to the First Street Bridge for this season and have to remobilize for next fall.
But the bank where we found that plume and all the bricks and everything, that's all been covered now?
It's, Mayor, council, it's been encapsulated. You can see that brown core fiber matting along the bank. It will be vegetated, and the vegetation will hold. One of the things that we do have to figure out, though, that occurred to us, they did put some steps in here, some boulder steps down, because we're going to have to be very protective of that bank for about the first 3 years and try and keep people from going up and down that bank, because it will harm the work that we've done until the vegetation comes in and holds it back.
Thank you. Well, what's your pleasure, council? Are we okay with submitting this grant? We are. Okay. On to dog parks. Boy, it's been so long since we've had a chance to talk about dogs. We're long overdue. So you guys have been doing some work on options and ways to go about this. You all saw the information in our packet, so why don't you walk us through the choices, Carter?
Perfect. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Members of the council, we have been asked, if you will, to bring this back, as it were, to talk about options that council could consider and potentially direct staff to pursue, not only with regard to what you see here as it relates to the east side dog park that we've spent some time discussing and whatnot, but also as it relates to other potential improvements that council would like to see in what many of you called grassy kinds of parks. And so, yes, we do need some direction as it relates to features that you'd like to see here. We provided some menu options, if you will, with cost and so on. That would be helpful tonight. But we'd also like to entertain the concept of potentially looking at a grassy dog park as well. And you'll recall that some of that discussion was directed more towards the west side of town, as it were. And so any of those types of directives that you would like to give tonight, or homework that you'd like us to follow up on for that phase of this discussion this evening, would be helpful as well. So with regard to that table setting, if you will, for this item, I'd like to defer the remainder of our conversation to Mr. Cortez and go from there. Good.
Thank you, Mayor, members of council. I'll just kind of walk you through a couple attachments that I have with regard to this particular. We just have one option today to fill you in on, but it's got a lot of options within the one option. So I kind of wanted to make you aware of the kind of the costs and the features that we could put into it, because I think it provides a good, kind of trajectory and us food for thought for future. Basically, just like I've said in previous iterations, they're your parks, so you can direct us however you'd like us to go with regard to dog parks, and there's a variety of ways to go. I mean, it's thousands of different avenues we could go. But with this one, these are also in your packet, but this one you'll see that we have a bunch of different numbers within the park. This would be Rocky Mountain Oncology right here, and then basically where the camera's at would be 2nd Street. You'll see that we have a bunch of different numbers here, and they relate to another attachment, which I'll show you here in a second. But before we leave this slide, I want to show you this right here would be grassy areas. within this park, kind of that speckled feature that you see there, and then this really dense stuff would be more of a native, and then this, the stuff that you see that isn't addressed at all would be just native and kind of its natural habitat that you currently see. These stars that you see within the pond, those are water features. We have to churn the water to keep it from getting kind of filled with algae and bacteria and stuff like that. So that's something else that we'd have to put in there. You also see up in this corner just below the word document, that's a parking lot there. And then you'll see that these, some are in blue and some are in red. And those are important because as we were walking through what it would cost us to put it in, I think it's important to recognize that you don't have a park until a certain point is achieved. You know, you got a certain amount of amenities and then you can call it truly a park. But then there's also a lot of frills you could put within a park. You don't necessarily need them, but if council so directed, we would put them in. And those are in the blue. So red is kind of essential items, blue is not. For instance, you look at the parking lot, it's got a red or a blue 12. We identified as not a must-have. You could do on-street parking, but it's not ideal. Obviously, off-street parking is kind of the ideal, hence why it's kind of a maybe an add-on, if you will, or kind of more of an option. If we could flip to the other chart, let's flare just that Excel spreadsheet. So this is also in your packet, and I realize this is probably hard for you to read. But basically, it just corresponding number tells what the description is of it. It gives you an initial cost, and then we also included what it would cost on an annual basis to kind of maintain that feature or what have you. And obviously, some of them are zero. But you can see like just the grading and doing the dirt work for a dog park to make it usable, functional. The water, you know, runs properly off of the ground. $60,000. Obviously, we don't have to do anything ever again with it, really. So it's got an annual cost of zero. But I think that's important because if you recall, we only received $100,000 kind of to launch the park, if you will. And so, as I just described earlier, $100,000 doesn't really get you a whole long ways with regard to building an actual park. And that's, you know, I guess if I was going to pass on a message, that would probably be what it is. But then you can see a variety of other things that to us, it's like if you really don't put in one of these features, we really don't have a park. We've kind of missed something that's probably critical to us calling it a park. And if you look at all these red items, your total just comes just over the $300,000 mark. I believe it's about 307. So basically what I'm saying is right now we have the funding for about a third of this park, if you will. And you know, that's kind of where we're kind of coming to you for some more direction to kind of figure out what your appetite is for, you know, us finishing the red items, or if you want to see some of the blue items. And they're just, it's a menu, just like Carter said, for us to figure out which direction we want to go. And then also translate into any other future facilities that you want. We've talked about a bunch of different options within our community as dog parks. Some are very cheap, meaning we just put up a little bit of fence and it's already green and grass, and we just say, hey, your dog can go here. And for that would be a very small cost. But there's also others like this where it's kind of more of a blank canvas that's going to take some more funding. So I guess with that, I would, if you'd like to see anything else, or if you have any questions, or if there's more homework and research we can do, we'd be more than happy to do so.
Okay.
Can we go back to the first one? I thought when we originally, if I may, Mayor, sure. Thank you. I thought when we originally talked about this, we originally just talked about fencing off just a small portion so the dogs can go in the water, but we're not doing the whole thing. We talked about a path, but then a little section for the dogs to go in the water, and it was more undeveloped than developed, is what I thought. What we discussed was at the south bottom part. Am I remembering that wrong?
Mr. Mayor, Council, if I may, I think that was certainly one of the options that we had discussed, but if you recall, we had kind of a good handful of different options, and I don't really think we had a good consensus from council as far as that's what we want to see. I will say this, with that particular idea, this is the actual dog park piece of the park. I mean, this is the fenced-in portion, but from what I recall when we were talking about the animal ordinance and how it kind of, you know, dovetailed into dog parks, if you will. A lot of it revolved around dogs threatening children and people. And so for us, a fenced-in area probably is the only way to achieve that goal. You know, meaning if we were to kind of what you proposed, Councilman, we probably wouldn't be allowed to have children and other people that don't have pets within the area, because there would always be that threat that they would, you know, run up on your child or something.
Well, I thought we talked about putting a fence around a section of it so the dogs can go in the water, but yet it's still fenced in, is what I thought we were talking, because we talked about how big the land was, but that they had an option to go in the water, kind of like the other one, but that may have been in my head, so.
Not that we couldn't do that.
Really, we could do that. We would have to run the fencing, you know, into the water though, because all the dog would have to do is go out here and go
Right.
around the fence and be back where it could threaten children and stuff.
Mike?
But totally doable.
Well, I think that we all probably had our own impressions about this. First question that I have is that figure 8 area there, is there a figure for how much it would cost to fence that, the blue fence around that? Am I thinking that,
Yep.
am I understanding that that's would be a fenced
And that would be
in
about,
area?
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, that would be about 54,000.
54 to.
So that's a vinyl coated fence. It's about 1,200 lineal feet to get around that area.
And then to run the red fence all the way around, is that what you're saying is 54,000?
I apologize. Actually the red border you're seeing here is just the property line.
Oh, okay.
This would be the only fenced-in portion of the park.
Okay. Well, I misunderstood that. I thought that
Sorry.
red thing around was the fence and that there was a separate blue fence. There was gonna be a red vinyl coated fence and a blue one.
We could certainly do that.
So yes, that blue
Yeah,
fence.
because I know
Okay.
my impression and what I kind of envisioned out there was something along the lines of Murad Park that's just basically, basically an undeveloped park where people could go out there and let their doggies run free and all that. But like I say, I think everybody probably had their own impressions of that. But that's all I wanted to ask about or say.
Because at Murat Park, other people go through there, cyclists,
Mhm.
walkers, of course, and they just understand that I'm now in an unleashed area.
Yeah.
Other questions, comments? Ken, go ahead.
Well, my suggestion is what I kind of mentioned, I guess, is run a fence and just do a small section of that for the dogs, because it's a huge area. Just kind of the path goes around. I don't know how the path would go, but just where they could go in the water. But then I also mentioned the water features, like what Wright has. It's just gorgeous, and then it has the deck that other people could come on without being involved with the dog. But still undeveloped though, not grass, our artificial turf or anything of that nature for that area, but that's what my thoughts were.
Mr. Mayor, I wonder if a way to focus the discussion here would be to maybe get a general consensus of everybody. Is our consensus that we want to have the whole area kind of like Murad Park is, or do we want to, divide it up and have a playground and all that?
I mean, my answer is I would like to do what the dog owners want us to do, and I don't. There was a group, if you remember, when the Andrews predecessor suggested that we require people to leash their dogs. You remember when it was 2 public works directors passed, and then they were up in arms and formed a group, and I don't remember the name of the group. Do you? But they were kind of the voice of the dog owners. Again, I'd hate for us to make a decision and then find out that it's not what people wanted. So, Steve?
Well, I guess I know Councilman Huber is wanting to narrow down our scope, but I think something that we need to consider as well, talking about if we went all out, we're talking about $1 million and adding $41,000 a year annually to our operating budget. And yet we are talking about needing $2 million to finish First Street and downtown.
Midwest.
I mean, Midwest, I'm sorry, yes, to finish Midwest, that we have not gotten grants for. And I guess we, as a council, need to be starting to look at where do we need to be focusing our money with limited resources. Just like, you know, if you don't get that extra overtime next week, what are you gonna buy this week? And that's kind of where we are. And if you're really watching some of the oil and things, this isn't gonna be another 13 or 14. We're looking at 16 and 17. And my concern is that, granted, it's in, like I said, it's in my area, but yet I don't know as we can really afford as a city to spend $1 million on a dog park when we're trying to develop downtown and we need $2 million down there. And I think along with that, I'd mentioned to you folks, do we really need to be spending $450,000 to put 10 foot on both sides of the bridge down there? Because that's, you know, that's half of our Midwest Avenue project. If you took $500,000 here and that $500,000, you're halfway with Midwest. So I think some bigger priority settings may need to come about.
I would
before we
I would
pick
see
out
these
all
as
of
two
these.
different things, because if we pour the sidewalk at 5 feet, it's gonna be 5 feet forever. Can't ever go back and fix that. Could you see a way, Tim, for us to do something more along the lines of what Ken is suggesting? And then if people still want a grassy area at a later point in time, that we could add that? And because that's where a lot of this expense is all of the irrigation and the grass planting and the maintenance. Without that, you really do have more of a Morat Park situation. It'd just be about control of the access and safety.
Mr. Mayor, Council, I think that's a prudent discussion. I think based on what Councilman Cathy just said, I think that was kind of the point of tonight was, we still have time, you know, we can't break ground on anything for quite some time, so we're prepared to do whatever you want from a phased-in approach. Obviously, kind of what Councilman Bates's point too is going to be a lower cost option, but if you recall in the background when we were kind of asked to do this research, having grassy areas for the smaller dogs and kind of all that, it was kind of in that discussion as well, so that's kind of why we kind of gave you the whole kit and caboodle, if you will, and then we're more than happy to value engineer to whatever council.
I appreciate the menu because, you know, we can now pick and choose. Without having all these things in front of us, we wouldn't even know what the choices were, so, Ken?
Well, and I brought up, this has been big on me since we passed that dog ordinance, which I supported, of the leash, but to allow the, as Councilman Huber says, the foo-foo dogs, to allow them to be in nicer areas. So I was also talking about some of these larger parks like Washington Park, even PV Park, that are grassy areas, to just put up a fence that's large enough that somebody could take their golden retriever out, throw a frisbee, throw a ball down the way, and the dog can retrieve it. And if they don't want to worry about their dogs getting thistles and stickers and things like that in their hair, they have another option. And so I would like to see some parks that are big, that has a lot of room to just put in a fence and allow people to have their dogs there. Parks that we talked about is the one on the school that's by the mall. There's that huge
Berta James, yeah.
Berta James. We talked about that. We talked about Washington. We talked about Nancy English and over MPV area. We talked about 3 spots that people could take their dogs like that and do that. I would like to see that, to give those people that like to take their dogs and throw the ball Cause I was watching all summer, watching kids go, or people take their dogs to, the soccer fields, saw 20 different people in the soccer fields throwing the ball for their dogs, cause they wanted that big grassy open area. Saw it at other parks, so it's a need out there that I don't think it'd be that expensive for us to do. And to give back to the community for their dogs. But I don't know how council feels about that.
Bob?
Yeah, I share Councilman Cathy's concerned about spending a considerable amount of money to develop a park. And I say that only because once we develop a park, even though it's zone park, if we don't develop it, you can change its use. And in that location, it's a pretty prime area for some use someday. But once we develop it as a park, it's pretty hard to undo it, as I recall, by statute. So.
Well, Mr. Mayor, I agree with a lot of what Councilman Bates and Kathy and Hopkins just said. What I think might be a logical thing to do at this point would be to just simply designate that area as a dog park where people can let their doggies run around and do what dogs like to do out in open areas. I can't think of a reason why we couldn't kind of just, because we already own that property, as I understand, why we couldn't just designate that at this point. Then, my next phase of the development of that would be to put like a 4 or 5 foot chain link fence basically around the whole property to encapsulate it as that and tell people, okay, this whole area is a dog park now. Later on, we might turn some of it into some other kind of a park or something. I would also like to, like I look at the city park downtown. I don't understand why we couldn't take like an 1/8 or a quarter of one of those blocks that's not on Center Street, but say like on David Street, put a 3 foot fence there and put a sign up that says small dog park, for your small dogs, so that they can take their little doggies there and let their little doggies run around. Maybe in Washington Park or maybe somewhere else there might be an area that we could fence off for bigger dogs that, okay, big dogs can come and run around and you can play Frisbee with them here. And I would propose that we look at going forward with something like that, because I don't think we'd be spending a big chunk of money like this. This is all really cool stuff. I mean, in an ideal world, hell yeah, do it to start tomorrow. But to have some things so that that are affordable. They're not getting us into a big pile of money, not getting us into too much of a continuing obligation, because it's just like at home. I can't go buy every single thing that I'd like to go buy, and I know nobody else in the room can.
Tim, could you bring up the list of red items again, and let's just see if council feels that any of these things would need to be read, because red, you're saying, is essential. Right?
Sure, yeah.
Who was waiting? I'm sorry. Sean.
I just wanted to say that I also have a concern about the price tag, and Councilman Hopkins' concern on zoning at a park, and then I think that Councilman Bates is right in maybe looking at parks that we already have.
Which we could do if we spent less money on this.
Right.
Ken, then maybe we can look at this and see if any of these things, I guess, should stay red, is really the question.
Just to clarify, the reason why we chose this area is because there was a designated amount of money that had to be put into this specific area, and it can't be used for other areas. Is that correct?
That would be correct.
And how much was that?
100,000.
100,000. That's.
It was part of the planned development, so it is kind of like, it's supposed to be park space. It was deeded over to us for that purpose.
For that.
And then the $100,000 that they had to give us was pretty much earmarked for this particular.
That's what I.
But you know, also at the same time, we can still do some grading and some very basic work that you'll see from the stuff in the red, meaning, you know, the grading, I think, just probably has to be done to get it to drain properly, and it would set the stage for anything future, like you kind of talked about a phased-in approach, that probably need to be done. But then as far as the fencing, that would change with kind of the direction I'm getting now, that would obviously change, but, you know, obviously there's a cost there, but pathway and some of these other things, and then the turf, and along with the discussion, could not be red anymore, I guess, is kind of what I'm getting at.
Steve?
Tim, I think Mike, the question I had is kind of back to what Mike was saying. Can you just designate it as a dog park today the way it sits? Or what requirements would we need to meet? And I guess I'm more so looking at, you look at that water feature in there, or you have to have the water moving. I'm assuming that you don't want to have algae and animals getting sick and whatnot. So are all these requirements here in red that we would have to do in order to make it a park, or can you do essentially what he was just saying and just designate it as a dog park?
Yeah. Mr. Mayor, Councilman, I don't think that we have to do all the things in red. I can answer that piece. However, probably defer to Mr. Henley maybe, like, it is public property, it was deeded to us in September. So it is city property, if you will. I just don't know if it would have to be designated as a dog park to allow people to actually go on the property to kind of use it as they will, or.
John, and then we'll get to you, Chris.
Okay, thank you, Mayor, Council. You wouldn't have to designate it as such, but certainly you could open it to it, open it as such. I think Murad Park is not really defined as a dog park. It's not designated as such, and I think we have some reasons originally just because of the flowing water next to it, and we don't want to designate it as actually a dog park. Forget the exact designation, but you could still permit, as it is city property, what you're going to do with it. And you could say, you know, this area is available for the use of dogs, and then if something different arises in 10 or 15 years or 7 or 8 years or whatever, then you could maybe modify that. But I think Councilman Hopkins is absolutely correct. Once it gets designated as a park for the city, then it is very difficult to back that out.
Mike, and then we're gonna have to make some decisions here. Oh, I'm sorry, Kristen.
Oh, okay.
No, go ahead, you were waiting.
The only thing I was gonna say is I feel like we're maybe being a little contradictory to what we recently passed with the dogs. I guess to me, if there's not a fence around this, I don't know how we can, in good faith, say that this is a dog park, considering that there's an apartment building right across the street. And so what if somebody at the apartment building has their dog on a leash, which is following the law that we passed, and somebody's in this quote-unquote dog park that doesn't have a fence, and their dog just takes off and goes and kills the dog on the leash? That, I guess to me, like, unless there's a fence, I don't think that we should be calling this a dog park. Because we're the ones who passed the law saying that they have to be on a leash. Unless they're in like a fenced enclosed area that's safe and keeps them from doing those things.
Something else, Mike?
Well, as I understand it, there's a stipulation attached to this property that there's $100,000 that's quote dedicated to be used on this piece of property. This $60,000 worth of grading, I'm presuming that would still enhance the value of this ground, even if we didn't turn it into a park. And so I'm wondering if that might not be a prudent use of part of that $100,000 that's attached to this property. I'm sitting here looking at it, and you know, if we're going to allow or encourage or anything else people to take their dogs there, those aeration features, which I think is like $30,000, probably pretty vital, because just looking at this photo here, and if I look at this, it looks like algae growing around the edges of this pond as it is. And I think maybe something that we could do rather than designating this as a park and a quote dog park is just designate it as an off-leash area and do that. So if we put in that aeration and did that grading, that would be you know, $90,000 of that $100,000. Or if we just did the grading and then said it's an off-leash area, and if you want to let your dog swim in that algae-laden water, you can.
If we wanted to go with Kristen's idea, Tim, do we know what the perimeter would be of the entire area?
I don't know what it is offhand, but basically, you know, there's a lineal foot, and I can't remember exactly what that is. I want to say it's around $14 a lineal foot for the fencing, and it'd be very easy for us to figure that out. I just can't do it for you right
So if we did those two things that Mike's suggesting and the fence, that would be kind of a minimum then.
And we'd be way over the 100,000.
Well, yeah, of course, but not a million either, so, Ken?
If I remember right, that's a huge piece of property, cause I remember, Councilman Frill, asking about it, and that's why I wanted to say we suggested the bottom portion and just fence in a smaller section, because then that would decrease the fence size. And then if we want to develop it more in the future, we could, but to cut down on the costs, I do believe the features to keep the algae down, I agree with that, but fencing the whole thing, I don't see that we need to fence that much of it at this time. We're just talking about a dog park that's not up for it. So I think we need to put the stuff in, but use the money wisely for the dog park that we talked about.
And Tim already alluded to this. I think it's highly unlikely that we could successfully somehow create a barrier that a dog couldn't get under or over and then literally just circumvent our fence.
How does it work in McKenzie, Tim? Cause we have water access there. Oh, we don't?
Yeah, no,
Because that's
Mr.
fenced.
Mayor, there's no water in the park proper. You know, people would have to let their dog out of the fenced in area and go over to that pond there that's by Knife River.
Steve, then Rob.
Your 60,000 grading, how much were you gonna be grading of that park?
Yeah, you'd be looking pretty much kind of about, if you bisected this line right here, kind of all this
All of
back
that.
here would be kind of graded roads.
Yeah, we don't need
The rest of it stays pretty native.
Well, the reason I was asking, if you grade that, this is where it leads you to from a construction and everything standpoint. If you grade all of that, you're gonna destroy all of the vegetation. You're gonna have to do something with vegetation then, otherwise you're gonna wind up with massive silt runoff and mud and everything else. So if we grade, you're leading down the path of having to plant something to hold and stabilize the soil.
And you're saying we need that for drainage purposes too?
I would recommend it just from having that canvas for future development, but the councilman, you are correct. But we do have the hydro seeding equipment, and it's kind of, I don't want to say it's a negligible cost, there is a cost, but we do have the equipment and the knowledge and expertise to hydro seed it, and, you know, kind of, it would still take some time for it to.
Because I assume it drains to the pond, because that's where the water ends up, so there must be a natural grade. Bob?
No, I was just kind of thinking of the places I see dogs playing, and I think, okay, the disc golf courses, have no idea how many acres there. Edna Kimball Wilkins Park, Murad Park, the current dog park that we've got fenced for specifically off-leash dogs. We've got the Amico area. There's a lot of people I know that like to run their dogs down kind of a trail on the right side. Not necessarily on the pavement, but on the dirt. And they get in their car and they drive and they do the same thing up at the event center. A lot of people go up there where the airplane guys play, and they'll have their dog hop out of the truck, and then they go clear to the other end of the road, you know, down where it intersects the, I guess it's the access road to the highway. And there's a lot of people that use that, and I just question whether we wanna spend this much money on 2.28 acres when there really are a lot of other places they can go. And I realize Murad Park is a ways out of town, but there are a lot of people that do take their dogs out there to run, and they like the water there.
Now, I hear what you're saying, but we did make a promise.
We promised to look at it, that doesn't mean it needs to be done today.
No, it doesn't have to be done today, but I think we did promise the dog owners, we're requiring your dogs to be on leash, but we're gonna give you some other places to, play with your dogs. So I feel like we should move forward with something, but I'm hearing that we're not interested in, you know, something as extensive as this, or extensive and expensive. Tim, do you think you could look at the Councilman Bates' idea and and maybe give us a sense of the size of this and how it would maybe compare to Mackenzie Park in terms of size, cause I don't know how big of an area is required. I agree with the aeration probably being critical, and maybe give us a cost figure on that. And then maybe take a look at this grading and say, do we really have to tear all of that up to make this work? Cause that's another cost we could maybe cut back on. And come back with us with a proposal, and then maybe, like I say, later on, if it's clear that we need to protect the smaller dogs with a separate area or whatever, if we're in a position to do so, we could do that later. And then, go ahead, Steve.
Oh, just as a point, talking about size, to give people ought to be able to get a rough size. You see the parking lot up there in the corner, each one of those spaces ought to be roughly 10 feet wide. So you can take, and as long as you don't keep expanding and contracting, you can take, and that's 100 feet, and just start laying that out around, and you can figure out on your own kind of what size roughly that is.
If we were gonna look at the south end of the pond, then the parking lot would probably need to be in a different place, wouldn't it? So you'd have easier access.
All I was doing was so that people
Yeah,
could start getting a
but
feel
I'm
for
just-
size.
As you reconfigure this, I
As a way to
we should
scale that.
Rethink where people would park if we are gonna look at that lower area. Couple more comments and then we're gonna have to go on.
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, I'm just wondering, since there's mention made of like out on around north of the event center up there, I wonder if it might not be a good idea to think a little bit about if there are perhaps the northernmost reaches of that area out there, if it wouldn't make sense to designate that as an off-leash area. And again, I wouldn't have a really big problem with just designating this property as an off-leash area, and
Without a
hopefully
fence.
without a fence, and hopefully people take care of.
We're gonna have to decide that, whether we're gonna move forward with that. Kristen?
I would just say, if that is the direction that council chooses to go to, that we really need to get input from the residential people that live directly across that street in the apartment complex. They might have children, I'm sure someone who lives there has a small child, and their pets that they probably keep on leashes. And so, I mean, that very much directly affects them, so I think they have to be part of that conversation.
Tim, do you think we could just look at it as an option and just kind of step back? And would you agree with Councilman Bates that the southern end would be the right area to include if we wanted to have some water available to the dog owners and try to, I don't know, put a fence right across the pond at some point? Is that a possibility?
Yeah, okay. Mr. Mayor, I think we can bring all that back. Yeah, I just wanna make sure I do got a point of clarification of, the way I'm kinda hearing it is like probably Ixnay about 75% of what's on the menu. It sounds like we're getting kind of more the more basic approach.
At least
more
at this
native
time, I think,
areas.
is what I'm hearing, yeah.
Okay. That gives me plenty more to work with, so yeah, we can do that.
Ken, does that sound okay with your plan then?
Oh, yeah, I think that'd be, great. I think that's what I was thinking. But if we could also, look at parks again, that would be, that we could, fence off grassy parks areas. We could look at 2 or 3 in city, and get prices on just what it'd be to fence, and again, that'd be awesome.
Without necessarily water access or any of these other things, just a fenced off area with some signs. Okay. Is that enough for tonight? Are people okay with taking a look at that option and getting the cost figures? We're not gonna fence the whole area, maybe find an area that topographically we can fence easily with maybe a little water access and big enough space to, allow the dogs to run and then create a safe environment for the neighborhood, it sounds like. Is that enough for you, Tim, to move forward?
And you also want to look at some other, we've done this before with other parks, just carving out some areas of other parks. Would you like to see that as well?
Yeah. How does the rest of you feel about that? I'm also in favor of that, especially for the smaller dogs, to have some safe area for them.
Could I ask a follow-up to that then? Would you like just various areas, the problem we ran into the last time we did that, was there was some programming in some of those spaces that we wanted to occupy. I mean, midget football's a great example.
Yeah.
Would you like us to avoid those places,
Yeah.
or
see if there are some ways to do that in the larger spaces.
Maybe the higher priority ones would be where we think we don't have conflicts with.
Oh, right. Right. Okay. All right, thanks, and we'll get that on the work session agenda for, how much time would you need, Tim? How much time would you need before we visit this again?
I don't need much time, probably a month would be more than.
Sometime in early January, mid-January, or early January, okay. All right, sounds good, thank you.
Appreciate everything you've done. Thank you.
All right.
You've got Thanksgiving you gotta get to.
Okay.
And Christmas.
That's right.
City Hall Safe Project Part 2, Carter.
All right, thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. The last time we visited about some rework of this building, council had a few questions and suggestions and so forth, and we took that information and tried to prepare additional information to bring back to you to hopefully answer some questions for you and potentially get direction into a way that you'd like to go. We submitted to you kind of what I would consider a critical path to consider to move forward with. We also submitted some better information as it relates to budget and what it looks like from a cost standpoint, if you looked at the exterior, if you looked at the first floor and the second floor. And I believe we also submitted some drawings that were a little clearer so you could see what it looks like and how it lays out on our building here and everything else. In addition to that, we tried to hone down a little more closely how we would fund a project of this nature. And I believe one of the attachments that we gave you some insight as to what premium that might add if we extended this over time. As an example, if we looked at a 5-year rollout, kind of the extreme, if you will, of funding this project, we do believe that would bring probably an additional $236,000 to the cost of the project to extend it over a period of, say, 4 or 5 years. Conversely, with regard to potentially extending this through 21 and getting a more aggressive approach to this, we think that brings a cost to about $3.1 million, and initially we thought it'd be just an even $3 million overall. So, there's a variety of ways that we can look at this. There's a number of approaches that we can take. We can answer your questions more succinctly as to what the remodel would look like with exhibits like we have here on the screen. We can go in a number of directions this evening as to which you'd like to do. I can tell you this, what I would hope we can do would be that we could move forward and start the process of getting this done. As I mentioned, you have a picture of what that looks like from a timing standpoint. In the very best scenario, we think it's going to be about a 2-year program, and we do think that by the time the project is complete, we may need to use some space over in the Ash Street building in order to continue the project in a relatively ambitious manner. And that works out pretty well in that we think that building is going to come open in the very early part of 2022. And that would give us the space we need to finish the project and be done and hopefully not have to worry about working on this building again for another 30 years. To answer another real critical question of yours as it relates to funding in general, one of the things that I mentioned as an idea to consider, we do believe that we can generate the funding over time, particularly as it relates to the sale of assets that we have, some of which we've talked about already and are working on, some of which we've already done, and some of which we may need to consider here in the future as a possibility for this as well. The revolving land fund currently has $1.1 million in its total as a fund balance. And so, to me, that would be a real natural place to look at funding this project if you buy into the theory that the proceeds of those land assets and otherwise make sense as a funding source for this project. We also have a fund that has about $2.4 million in it, the corpus of which was originally anticipated to be a funding source for LED kinds of projects. I'm not sure necessarily that is a fund that we need to keep into the future as it relates to LEDs, because we tend to fund projects, particularly neighborhood type street projects, if you will, based upon current dollars available to make those projects happen. Nonetheless, if council would like to see that fund be maintained into the future, I do think that would at least represent an opportunity to cash flow the project in the near term, with the idea that funds that we gain in the future we could use to backfill that fund to try to keep it whole. And certainly as it relates to the revolving land fund, I would think further direction would be needed to see what you'd like to do with that fund in the future. There's been some conversation with previous councils that maybe a revolving land fund isn't absolutely necessary for the operation of our organization. That I think is still something we could use direction on as well. But nonetheless, we do think that the funds are available. I would recommend that if we do use the LED fund, that we do backfill it as we go over time, so that the project effectively pays for itself, and we don't leave a fund empty, unless of course that just doesn't become a necessity in your mind. I'm trying to give you some options to think about, and give you some insight into some of the conversations we've had internally as a means of trying to look for funding for this project. My point is, as it relates to funding, I do think we can fund the project, and I do think it would be appropriate to backfill over time so that we don't have to look to 1% to try to cover it. We don't have to look to general operations from the general fund to try to cover it. I wouldn't feel good about pursuing those kinds of avenues, although this building is one of the original 1% buildings. And so it wouldn't necessarily be entirely inappropriate, in my opinion, from a policy perspective, to consider 1 cent dollars. I will tell you that over the next 4 years, we've kind of spoken for the 1 cent dollars that are coming through 1 cent 16, and so that would probably represent more of my hesitation than the idea of using 1% at all.
Unless we have some unallocated at the end of the year.
Absolutely, absolutely.
You betcha. Ready for questions, Carter?
I am indeed.
Steve?
2 questions. The acronym, my mind's going, LAD.
Yes, sir.
What is that?
Local Assessment District.
Okay. Thank you.
You betcha.
I just went right over. When was the last time any money was ever used out of that fund?
Out of that particular fund?
Yes.
Mr. Mayor, Councilman Kathy, it certainly hasn't been within the last 3 years since, I've largely been here. Andrew, could you tell us beyond that?
For Casper too, right?
Mr. Mayor, Council, I believe that is correct. Last LED we did in this community was for Casper Phase 2, and that was over 8 years ago. A bit longer than that.
And 3 was originally intended to be part of the 1 cent 15 cycle, but we simply couldn't fund it in that period of time for all the reasons you know about. So the people in that section of town had to wait.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. You know, the building is 40-plus years old, and while I think we've maintained the building reasonably well, it's dated. And I think we saw from the security review that we were all presented. I guess I'd prefer to go with option one and just get started on it. It's not gonna get any cheaper. And it does fit in with the time when the state will probably be leaving our other property. So I think we'd have a place to go, and quite honestly, I think we'll probably hang on to that building in the long run, but it's also gonna need some updating too eventually. So I think it's kind of important that we maintain our city infrastructure and our city campus, if you will, and I prefer we just go ahead and get started.
I've had concerns about it. Like I said, originally we just talked about making it more secure and making sure that staff is secure, and then we were talking about redoing it or adding to it, and I think of budget-wise, and I'm not an accountant, so at all, but I look at, and I know you said that 1 cent wouldn't necessarily go to it, but I sit here and I go, okay, we just approved the mayor's position to move to $300 a session. We need to look at Midwest because we didn't get that grant, so we're gonna have to look at paying for that somehow, some way. Then we have the fire station, we have the police station, we have City Hall. To me, everything's adding up, and some way, somehow, the citizens of Casper are gonna be the one that's gonna be asked to pay for a lot of this. And then we're talking about raising taxes. Moving the optional 5 cent to a permanent 5 cent to an optional 6 cents and an optional 7 cents. And that is coming from the citizens of Casper. And so I'm real hesitant on asking for all of this. And then as Councilman Kathy pointed out, the oil is having its issues, the coal mine, everything that's going on here, things are changing for budget-wise, and I'm concerned about our budget and us adding too much to our plate. I believe we do need to get this more secure, without a shadow of doubt. Do I think we need to do all these add-ons with everything else on top of what we're doing? I'm really hesitant and concerned budget-wise. You know the budget better than I do, by far, and if you say, Casper, we're good, I'll support you, but it scares me.
Just before I take it, I just want to clarify for people who might be reporting on this. This council has had no discussions about making the 5th cent permanent. There is no 6th cent currently under proposal, and there's been no discussion at all of 7th cent. Now, all of your points are well taken and your legitimate concerns, but I just don't want to get any of those things misreported.
Right.
Okay. So, who else? I'm sorry, who was waiting here? Go ahead, and then Mike.
I was just gonna make a point of clarification, because at one point I had kind of seen it the same way, but of course then in hindsight, actually thinking something through. It wasn't originally proposed to us as a safety project. There are certain things that we had to discuss in an executive session, which came first because of simply of timing, and then we had the aesthetics discussion during a public meeting. I don't think that it was meant to be presented to us as separate pieces, like, well, this is the background stuff that we didn't want to bring up first. It had to be separated because of the function of speaking about those things horrible word, in the proper environment, and then speaking about the other things in a proper environment. So it was the same discussion, it just had to be held in 2 separate pieces.
We didn't want to have a safety discussion in a way that
Correct.
would tell people the
Expose.
vulnerabilities.
Correct.
So, Mike?
I don't like overburdening ourselves with expenditures any more than anybody else does. But the reality is that the city government exists to serve the people. If we do not have, we could operate out of a shoebox. We could operate out of a single stall garage somewhere with a card table set up in it. But guess what? Citizens are gonna be lined up outside for blocks on end wanting to get services. The reality is that we gotta keep our facilities current to serve the people. If you look at the history, you know, what I still refer to as the city-county building, then it was the county building, then the county renamed it back to being the courthouse at 200 North Center. That was built in the 1930s as the city-county building. Well then, by in the 1970s, you know, we expanded out every 40 years or so. You gotta, you know, things grow. It's just like you outgrow where you are, and I think we need to move forward with this. Because otherwise, some council will be sitting here in 20 years from now, and it's like I say, you're operating out of a shoebox, and you're not serving the citizens and their needs.
Or worse yet, a bad incident happens, and why didn't you make this a more secure facility? So we can discuss the timing, the agenda, and the funding mechanisms. These are big decisions. Did you want to add, Carter?
Yeah, one thing that I really appreciate about what Councilman Bates has said and what Councilman Cathy has alluded to earlier, and many of you concur with, I don't like the idea of extending ourselves in such a way that we have financial concerns and we create financial concerns for ourselves into the future and so on. And so, you know, hopefully you can take some degree of comfort in knowing that with regard to funding this project, we aren't betting on the come. We're not suggesting that we put ourselves into an operational deficit to try to make this project happen. I would tell you indeed that the LAD fund, you know, will have some expiration of time to occur in order for it to be backfilled appropriately and so on. But the good news is we don't rely upon that fund to make projects or other operational things happen. And so we have that available to us, and I think it's not a bad resource to look to. Nor would I, you know, want to suggest that we put off other projects that have been allocated and decided upon in the current 1 cent cycle to make this project happen either. Because you all know, we took a lot of public feedback with regard to the establishment of those sorts of priorities and so on. And so that would make me uncomfortable as well. The other thing that I wanted to say too, that I really like about this approach, and I appreciate Mr. Murtha's help in helping us envision this project, how it can happen. I love the idea that we're not building a new building to make this happen. We are trying to work with the footprint that we have. We're trying to work with the bones that are available to us to extend this building's life another 30 years, and we're not building new. And so, you know, I would think that would resonate really well with our constituents and the citizens that come and expect services in this building. So I do feel really good about the approach. I feel really good about the philosophy behind a lot of what we talked about. And I do think we correct an amazing amount of deficiencies that we don't have good answers for right now. So I'm with you 100% in terms of the funding issues, because I'd much prefer seeing a more aggressive energy economy right now to help us. But I do think that the approach that we're taking is financially aware, for what that's worth. Mr. Mayor, thank you.
Comments or questions for Carter? Ray?
Yeah, kind of what Bob had mentioned earlier too, about getting started earlier is probably better and probably even more fiscally responsible to be able to do that now. You know, I really do. I think Carter hasn't steered us wrong in that direction. He sees that, he knows that, he's kept us balanced, worked with us on that. So I'm supporting that. I think we should probably start doing it now rather than later. And I like the point of view, and I think about that. I'm just sitting here thinking, we're not building a new building for $30–40 million. We're focusing in, we're gonna do with what we got. So I think that's a very, very pragmatic approach to move forward, that we're not trying to do this big building process. What we're doing with what we have and being able to spend what we have too. So that's where I'm
We
at.
do have some explaining to do, and that's a good way to do it, I think, Ray, is to talk about the much more expensive alternative. But in the background, if we are gonna go to the public for a police station, we've gotta make sure that the atmosphere is positive and that we don't somehow create the very perception that Councilman Bates is talking about, that we're just spending money left and right in a challenging economy. So what would you all like to do? Somebody wanna make a proposal here?
I propose we go with option one.
Okay, are we ready? Kristen?
Sorry, did you recommend whether you and staff's recommendation was to go with the revolving land fund first versus the LAD? Did I miss the recommendation, or were you just giving us both choices? Do you guys have a recommendation?
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, thank you for that question. It will likely be the marriage of the two funds in order to make the project happen, with the expectation that we would backfill at least the LAD fund.
Yep.
And further direction with regard to the philosophy concerning the revolving land fund, I think is needed as we move forward, but it would likely be emptied as a part of this as well.
Although that fund has played a very significant role in some of our development, and I would hope future council would consider reestablishing that or refunding it for those reasons.
Just a follow-up point, after this project was completed and we potentially looked at selling the Ash Tree building, the funds from that sale would backfill. I mean, they would belong in the revolving land fund typically, correct?
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, that would be what I would advocate for.
Okay.
That would obviously be your decision.
Okay.
Any other comments, questions? Should we do a thumbs up on the option number one?
I'm gonna sit on it.
Okay. Do we have 5? I think we do.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Okay. Good enough?
Thank you.
Okay. Council participation on boards.
Mr. Mayor, members of the council, this too is a follow-up item that we have had some discussion with in the past. Council had asked for the attorney's office to do some homework and research and maybe have that be some guidance with regard to what direction you'd like to give as it relates to council's participation on boards. One of the questions that has been certainly of interest to me over time is some of the difficulty that council has put in on an individual basis when it comes to serving a board and being a board member and choosing a direction as a board member that might be contrary, perhaps, to the general direction of this council. And so I think that conflict issue, in my opinion, is a really interesting question. And if I were in your shoes, I'd want some direction on, you know. There's a lot of other questions, however, that this conversation might engender. And so if I could, Mr. Mayor, defer the floor to the attorney to walk us through his analysis, of which I think you've seen a hard copy of. Haven't you in the packet?
It was in the packet.
Great. I anticipate some really good questions as a result.
John?
Great, thank you, Mayor, Council. The crux of this is as the manager has indicated, is really the conflict of interest. And you think about just you and some of your individual capacities, and I bet there's probably almost half of you that have approached me on the side and said, you know, have this going on, I've got this going on, is that going to be a conflict on this night or that night? Should I abstain? Should I declare this? Should I leave the room? Those are conflicts of interest. You just don't know where they're going to pop up, and you have to be cognizant of them all the time. And this council's been really very good about that. But that has raised the question, though, because these do kind of pop up, and you're all of a sudden there, and you're not really thinking about it. And you were very much attuned with some of these boards or commissions you might be involved with. And at some point, then, there might be a question about, well, really has your allegiance shifted to kind of now advocating for this because you're involved with this maybe smaller group of individuals and you've really kind of taken this project under your wing, and so now you're acting on behalf of that board or commission more than you are on behalf of the city council. And so there is that possible, not only of perception, but of an actual incident. And I will tell you that you know, when you all had me do the compaction ordinance, not none of you here, I think, but I think a couple of you in the past council wanted me to do that, and I originally was thinking, oh my gosh, yeah, why are we doing this? You know, but it was my project, and I undertook it, and you know, I worked on it hard. And boy, this is really one of the best ordinances ever. It was defeated 8-0, but but I mean, I was really gun ho for that. So I think that there's kind of that perception or that ability that we have to somehow adopt things, whether it's a nurturing thing, whether it's just a matter of ego, whether it's a matter that you just have that familiarity and you think you've thought things through so well in that you can't hear the people that you should be listening to. And so in that regard, that brought us to this question. And the regular boards and commissions, which are not joint powers boards, are maybe a little bit easier in some way because you're just going to be a liaison with them, or I would suggest that you just become a liaison with them and not really a member of a distinct board unless it is a joint powers board, because that really could be statutorily deficient. We have a statute in Wyoming that does provide that for joint powers boards, you have to be appointed by the council. The council makes that appointment. But it's a representative for the council to that board. But you don't have to come back to council and have everything approved. But if you do something wrong, the council can also unpunch your ticket, you know, not be the board representative anymore. So for joint powers boards, as you know, that's when we are involved with other governmental agencies. So we're working with the county, perhaps on the Hall of Justice, and we need to do an upgrading over there. Or we're working with the regional powers, regional water board, things of that nature. So we need to keep those projects moving along, and since it is another governmental entity, I think most people think there's going to be some interaction with them anyway. And so the legislature said it's okay if you go ahead and you can vote on those, and you can be an active participant. There's no violation, and you are not acting without authority to do that. However, if you go into a board where you're just the liaison or the contact for the council, and you start acting more, well, the council will do this. The council's behind you on this. Well, you can say, you know, my impression is the council may help you out on this, but I just don't know. I can't speak for you. I mean, those are just kind of the distinctions that you probably want to make, because you, in that situation, really cannot speak on behalf of the council. And there's, you know, cases out there that say that. So you would be acting beyond your authority, ultra vires in the legal terminology, and so we wanted to make sure that you were aware of that and that you're cognizant of it. And like I said, you've all been very good, and I appreciate you visiting with me and keeping that thought in mind. So the question I think probably becomes is, you know, do you want to go forward? Do you want a specific policy on this? Received communications from me, we've had this discussion, you feel comfortable with that. So there's really a couple of ways to look at that, and maybe we have some questions here, and that can help narrow down which direction you may want to go. So I'm concluded with my part of this, Your Honor, and if you want to have some questions for me, that'd be great.
Questions for John? I understand what you're saying, because there are awkward moments where especially on a joint powers board, where you want to be speaking for the entire council, but you're not really sure what everyone thinks. Well, that's why I brought the money to divide to all of you before I made any commitment. But it's hard to be consistent about those things, and sometimes you are asked, well, what do you think the sense of council is? And I kind of do what you just said. I think the sense of council would be, but I can't represent until we have a discussion. But you can't, of course, have a discussion every time an item comes up before you would cast a vote. Have anyone else felt these conflicts? I mean,
I would just tell them I don't speak for the entire council.
That's what I'm saying.
This is my opinion. I don't speak for.
I couldn't hear what you just said.
I just tell them that I don't speak for the whole council. I give my opinion on whatever it is, and that's it.
but sometimes we're actually asked to cast a vote.
But that's your job as a joint powers board member.
Bob?
I agree, it's a complicated issue, and sometimes you just have to make a choice. For example, the water board, that's a joint powers board of all the people that are probably elected officials, of all the people that are involved in it. And you have to make a decision. Now granted, you have to make a decision based on your ratepayers, which is different than making a position from city council to a joint powers board. We're talking about you have a fiduciary responsibility to our ratepayers. We want to cover the costs and make it right. So that's a little bit different. There are exceptions, and they do come about when you have a joint powers board dealing directly with another governmental entity. And sometimes you just have to make that choice, which one takes priority. And I think the paragraph, conflict of interest, the first paragraph on that top of the second page says that basically city council is the principal agent. So we are obligated, if there is a conflict on a joint powers board, city council has to be your fiduciary responsibility first. So
Makes sense.
it's not clear, but I think the intent is good.
Yes, very good, thank you. And it's not like all of these are zero-sum games where you always have to be at odds, because you work with people, you can get advantages for the city, at the same time you're maybe giving advantages to the county in the same type of project. So they're hard questions. You know, I think as long as your brothers are there, you're aware of the potential benefits of it.
Mr. Mayor, I think that, you know, this is an important subject, it really is. And I think it's something that we from time to time probably need to address. I have to say, though, that I don't think that it's something that is subject to black and white, yes and no answers. I really appreciate Mr. Henley's discussions with this, and I think that this document is something that we should, everybody should kind of retain and should be kept in some place. I don't know, you know, if the various memos and things, especially that we get from the city attorney's office, if those are cataloged, maintained, or anything like that in any place, so that in the future, if somebody has a question, well, what about conflict of interest with one of these boards? You know, you or a future city attorney could pull this out and say, well, here's what the city attorney said back in 2019, and when this councilman was, you know, acted in this manner on this board, he was acting under this advice from the city attorney. I think that would be a real worthwhile thing for us to do, is to, you know, to make sure that these things are kept somewhere, and I'm sure that they are. But I always worry that, you know, in a few years that somebody might come along and think, well, those are, you know, we can purge those files, or.
Well, it should be in the council handbook, I think.
I agree.
Yeah.
I was just about to mention that.
So, and part of the orientation process, which we already discussed. We didn't discuss it exactly the same way, but these things are part of the orientation, is what is the role of council member.
But I really think that this is probably as good of a discussion as you're going to get of these terms, because like I say, you are not going to be able to just say it's a yes, no, black, white thing when these things come up. So it's a lot more of, you know, these are the concepts that we have to try to adhere to.
And we've been pretty fortunate, I think, with our group. We get along, treat each other well, but we know that that's not always the case. And hopefully it'll continue like this. One of the concerns I have, John, is that I don't know that we have a mechanism in place where if there is a councilman who's violating these expectations, I guess we can't call them rules, but if there is a councilman that just isn't getting it, we don't really have a way to have a confidential discussion about them. It has to be done in public, where someone would essentially be shamed for their behavior. Am I correct about that?
I think in general you are correct about that, Your Honor. Certainly there could be, and maybe some of you have, or some of you will get, a letter from me saying, oh my gosh, we're kind of pushing the boundary here, and you may want to pull back. It seems like you were in a potential conflict of interest situation. You might want to consider that. There's a lot of ways to consider that. I'll be happy to visit with you, but here are some offhand ways, generalities that we can discuss that.
But it would be fine to go through you. If I had a concern about the behavior of a council member, I could write you and say, do you believe that there was a concern here or a potential violation? And then you could reach out to that person to say, this may be a violation of this.
I sure can, and I think that, again, if it's just a mayor approaching a councilman, that's not violent of the Public Records Act. You just say, I've been sitting here for a while, and I've been on this for a couple of terms, a couple of elections I've been retained, and it just seems that we had a problem with this. With a councilman in the past, I just don't want to fall into that trap again, and we might want to consider what you're doing here, and
Or a council member to council.
would be a possibility to that.
I wonder if that would be something to put in there, to say, if a council member has a concern that someone is not fully respecting the intent of this set of guidelines, or however you would want to put that, that they are certainly within their role to bring it up and have initiate a discussion with another council member, just to kind of give us all, and future members, permission to say, if you see this stuff going on, try to address it.
Yeah.
Does this, I guess, add or does that conflict with our code of ethics that we just passed?
And I think that's a good point, because I was thinking, as the mayor was talking, that there are certain conflicts that would be violative of our code of ethics. But there are other ones that, it's really not it's not a personal to your financial interest or to your family's interest or something like that. So it really wouldn't reach a statutory or code violation, but nevertheless, it would be where you might be violating your fiduciary duties to the council, and therefore really to the city.
Could you give us an example, just hypothetically, of how that would happen, John, so I know what you're talking about?
Well, and so the situation may be, well, I'm dealing with, because I work with the Regional Water Board, and my brother-in-law puts tank tops on, and I know that we have a tank top coming up here, and so I think I'm going to tell him he needs to start thinking about drafting and figuring out a way to have his bid come in the lowest. And so, that's something that you're probably in violation of state statute on, and certainly violating your duties to the council, and you're trying to benefit your family over and above the city and the council and other members of the public, other potential bidders, because of your insider knowledge. So that would be, one that would be statutorily prohibited, and code, the code we just adopted would be come into play there as well. But again, if you're just there and this is a project you've been working on, and my gosh, this is going to be so good for Casper, and I've been working with the old Yellowstone district or the downtown development district, and they're just so sold on this, you're blinded by it, and you kind of let yourself kind of get into that. It's not that you're going to have any personal financial gain, or that your family's going to have any personal financial gain, but you've just slipped into that mode where you cannot see now where you want, or you ignore because you were just so convinced in this particular project that your committee's been working on. You just adopted it wholeheartedly. That's a thing that really could sneak up and bite you. And it's not that it's going to bite you, you're not going to go to a jail type of way, but you're not doing the city a service. You know, everybody to do the city's work needs to do their job the best they can. And doing that, of course, is not to get into a conflict of interest situation. Be pretty attentive to that.
I think that was part of what brought the conversation up in the past, when kind of the sense that if you're on a board long enough and you get to know the people and appreciate their agenda, you lose your objectivity because you become a cheerleader for whatever it is that they're doing.
That's a good way to put it.
Hard for me to see that as a conflict of interest. I guess if you were looking against the long-term interests of the city. What do you would you agree that it should be in the council handbook, John?
I think things like this would be fine in the council handbook. And I was thinking, particularly after Councilman Huber spoke, that certainly this would be something that we'll want to emphasize in council orientations.
Is that sufficient for now to just kind of put it in there? And, okay, all right. Thank you. Financial guidelines, phase 3, Carter.
Mr. Mayor, members of the council, this is the third phase of the guidelines discussion that we've been having for several months now. I anticipate that we may have 1 or 2 more phases before we really have gone through the wide variety of questions and so forth that a good set of guidelines would otherwise answer for us. I really appreciate Tom and his team's efforts in putting all this together. The executive team has also provided input and given us some insights as well that I think in total will provide you a really good framework and skeleton, if you will, to move forward with into the future. And frankly, from a legacy standpoint, as it relates to, you know, the good things that Tom's team does, this is a real good way of making sure we memorialize best business practices into the future. So thank you for being willing to sit through this and give feedback on this and entertain these conversations. If it pleases the council, I'd like to defer some time to Tom to kind of walk us through some of the major tenets that this series of guidelines proposes. And please, if you have any questions or feedback or thoughts that we need to consider further, I hope you'll bring those forward.
Thank you. Tom?
Thank you, Carter, Mayor, Council. This set of guidelines, which included revenues, expenditures, budget, and some accounting and financial reporting, there's not a lot of new in here. A lot of this is a restatement of existing practices as well as memorializing some existing practices. There are a few things in here I guess I would just point out that maybe a little bit different than what in the past has been the practice. One of them is the use of revenues, and we've talked about this in the last budget session, trying to get to the point of using one-time revenues for one-time expenditures. A prime example of this is the direct distribution amount we get from the state. In past legislative sessions, it has been a hot topic of debate as to it in jeopardy. So we like to try to get away from the reliance on that. So in the policy, it has set the goal of trying to basically wean ourselves from using that for operations and to use it for one-time expenditures. We are not there yet. I think we made some progress. Again, that's why it's stated as a goal. So that is one thing we'll be trying to achieve and work towards. Another slight change in the practice has already taken place. Utility rates in the past, those have been set every 2 years. Last year, as some of you recall, we had an annual review. So that is something that is written into the policy that while it still offers the ability to set the rates every 2 years, it does require that at least annually we bring those back to you to review and to make sure we're on track and make sure no adjustments are going to be needed. Another slight change from the practice is internal service funds. Those are funds that provide services to other funds in the city organization on a cost reimbursement basis. Examples would be fleet, buildings and grounds, property and liability insurance. those always haven't been, the costs haven't always been entirely recovered. They're allocated out to the various departments that use it. So we're working on trying to get the methodology in place to recover the entire costs so that those will be self-sufficient and recovering all their costs. And finally, we hope to provide you, or will provide you with quarterly budget reports. These come out in the form of a pack or information packets. But we want to get something out to you throughout the year to keep you abreast of how we're doing budget-wise financially and report on the performance of that. So there were a lot of other things in here. We'd rather take a lot of time, and if anybody has any questions on them. And I guess I would just take this opportunity to, hopefully, as Carter mentioned, there'll be another phase. The next phase I would anticipate would be reviewing the practice of using 1% funds, going over what I call fund administration, basically going over the history and the purpose and what's in the funds that we have. We have a number of funds throughout the city, and each one acts as their own business. And so I think it's important to make sure you understand what those funds are and how they got started and what the intended purpose is. And then lastly, probably a statement on collections and write-offs, just how that practice would work. And I would certainly invite any other comments or suggestions that any of you may have. This would kind of finish what I anticipated for the guidelines. But if there's anything in this regard that you think we need to address, certainly open to that and to make sure we get it in there. But with that, I certainly have any questions on what's been presented tonight in this phase. I'm going to do my best to answer.
Steve?
Our rate model at Regional Water and even at the city, isn't it a 10-year rather than a 5-year when you're projecting out costs?
I can answer that. Can you, Carter?
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, I'm not the expert necessarily on how Regional Water views, their modeling and so on, but I do know that there was quite a bit of analysis taken a number of years ago that would suggest a longer-term view as it relates to some of the financial goals of a very complex system like Regional Water. When it comes to things that we look at on more of a microcosm sort of basis, we do try to project out 5 years on a pro forma sort of behavioral standpoint so that you can get somewhat of a feel as to what we're looking for in the future and potentially how that would impact what you're looking at right now. The challenge with water rates in general, and we're going to talk about this here in a couple weeks, is that it's so reliant upon favorable consumption in order for it to all work and for all the projections to make sense, that for us and for our microcosm view, it doesn't make a lot of sense to go 6 or 7 or 8 years into the future.
Well, and I guess what I was also looking at was, and I used Regional Water because I'm on that board,
right.
But Sam Hobbs wastewater plant,
Yep.
You have big expenditures that I am not sure that a 5-year program adequately covers some of your bigger ticket, longer lifed items. And I was wondering if that also was on that short of a period rather than a 10-year or a 15-year life cycle. And if that were the case, if then where it says we're going to do it based on a 5-year cash flow, it ought to be more like a 10-year cash flow to be able to take care of those bigger, longer term maintenance items. And then if under the revenue back on the bottom of page 1 of the memo to you, where it says utility enterprise funds sufficient to cover the entire operational cost Well, do you consider those part of the operational cost, or do you just consider the day-to-day consumables? And should that be then actually based on that 5-year cash flow, which is what you're actually gonna be setting your rates on?
Good question.
Yeah, very,
I
very
just-
good question.
just thought I would throw that out
Good
there.
series of questions, actually. One of the things that I don't recall, Tom, seeing in the policy statements that maybe we should consider is with regard to our reliance upon business planning as well. We are engaged right now in our relationship with CH2M Hill to put together business plans for our utility type enterprises. And those business plans definitely look outside of sometimes the narrow view we take as it relates to cash flow and rate setting and those kinds of things. Without a doubt, even in the more narrow view that we take sometimes as it relates to rate setting, capital is a huge driver for those types of discussions, and probably more so as it relates to the longer view business plan model that we're introducing into our paradigm of discussion for these enterprises. So I guess I would say yes to your complex question, that plant rehabilitation, pipe replacement, and the rates by which we want to do that, in my opinion, should all be interwoven at all levels of those discussions.
Yeah, well, and I guess you can tell that's kind of where I was leading from the business background is that I can't just plan for 5 years. I've got to plan for 20 years. And
Absolutely.
so, you know, if I have to replace 20% of my stuff every 5 years, then we need to be looking at that and making sure, because people don't understand that reserves are our savings plans. They think you're spending money that you have somehow come up with by overcharging. And they, seriously, and they don't understand that whole model of government financing versus private business financing and the terms that we use. And that was why I didn't know if we should try to bring that in here and somehow get that out to the public as well.
Bob?
Yeah, one similar item to what Mr. Cathy was talking about, under the third item there under revenues on page 1.
That's what I was talking about, yeah.
Yeah, the last sentence, utility enterprise fees, you could introduce a backslash operational slash capital costs.
You bet.
And that makes it very clear what we're really talking about.
You bet.
We gotta
That's a
cover
good
it, yeah.
suggestion, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it can be done by reserve.
And Tom, when you talk about trying to more accurately track the interagency costs, would I be correct in assuming that if we were more thorough about that, we would charge the enterprise funds for those interagency services and maybe see some reduction in the general fund as a result?
Yeah, we would definitely try to, wherever the service is rendered, we would try to make sure we accurately got those costs back.
Which could, of course, then translate into some rate increases to more accurately reflect the actual costs of the services the citizens get. Okay.
Yeah, I would think if, as an example of what you're talking about, if the garage has to spend $7,000 on one of the super suckers that belongs to waste treatment, then waste treatment ought to be paying that expense back to the municipal garage.
If I could, I'd like to make a couple comments addressing some of the questions that came up. The policy as written does indicate the use of consultants, which to me would bring in the business plans, and there was a reference to that in the policy. And the comments about the 10 years is very appropriate too. What's presented to council is based on the 5-year. When we put this together, an example would be the bail fill, which we just talked about, because they have cells that have to be open and closed throughout a period of time. So we do look at that. The challenge in presenting this, as far as setting rates, is that things change so quickly, even from year to year, and the capital demands change so quickly from year to year. At least from my perspective, I like to try to make sure we capture the big ticket items and the regular capital replacement. As we go through this process, I think you see there is a means of capturing that and recording that and getting that back through the rates. The other challenge is some of these big, huge projects, especially down the road, you never know for sure what funding opportunities may be available through the state to either fund the whole thing or part of the thing, and to base your rates on something that may happen 10 years from now when you potentially get funding for it. You could overfund it, but certainly it is something that needs to be considered. But while the performer you look at goes out 5, certainly there are projections out there. If there's anything really large looming out there that we need to be aware of.
So a good example of that would be one test that the EPA did where there was a spike up in the spore count, and now forever you're on the list of people that have to build a $12 million plant to treat your groundwater because of that one spiked test.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden there, you've got that on your plate.
That's exactly right. It's frustrating.
Yeah, it is. Any other questions for Tom? We thumbs up on these policies? Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Point out to all of you, we are actually ahead of schedule this evening.
Executive session.
And no executive session. All right, so let's do a little more thorough job of looking at the agenda for next week and make sure there isn't anything that sticks out for December 3rd.
So, Mr. Mayor, I would ask to be excused next week. I will be in Hawaii.
Well, that's no excuse.
No.
Right, exactly. The answer is no.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
You guys keep taking your fancy vacations.
Not unless you have 9 more tickets. The 8 of us plus Frida. Got to take Frida along, otherwise he's in deep trouble.
Okay, anything else on the agenda that sticks out for people as we look through this? We're gonna have a bunch of public hearings. Give everybody just a minute to look through it and see if anything jumps out. And why are we rejecting the bids for the booster station? Did they come up, did they not come up with our engineering estimates?
On that
Mr. Mayor, the members of the council, the basic reason is because they were way out of whack as it relates to the pricing that we were originally estimated at, and so we just did not feel comfortable moving forward with a request to you guys for that type of an overage.
And the system is working effectively, it's just old.
Yes, sir.
Anything else on the agenda?
Question about the salaries. The first reading, second thing down on second page.
Is that for the mayor's salary?
Mr. Mayor.
Is that what that is?
That's exactly what that is.
Okay.
That's right.
Okay.
And we're gonna try to get 3 done before the calendar year is over.
Okay.
Would I be correct in referring to that as a stipend rather than salary?
Mr. Mayor, it feels like a stipend, but it's actually statutorily referred to as a salary, isn't it? Yeah. But it probably feels more like a stipend.
Because a salary you get paid
Right.
whether you show up or not. Stipend you get paid
If you show up.
per event.
Well, that brings up a question. We've never addressed that either. If you call in, are you here?
I don't know, what is is the rule on that, John?
You know, I think that is actual attendance. As long as you're actually attending the full meeting, I think, you know, based on that research I did most recently, it seems like that would be appropriate to get paid for that.
So you could call in from Hawaii, Mike.
I might just do that.
We can make it happen.
It's a pretty expensive place to visit.
That is different, that is different than what we've done though.
Yeah,
But
well,
it's-
excuse me, I had my phone muted here. Bring dinner.
Sorry, Bob.
That is different than what we've done, but if.
Is it?
Yeah, we've never paid anybody when they called in, I don't think.
Well, Mr. Mayor, I think that if we're gonna say that, calling in is attendance, then, I think we have to be consistent. And, because somebody could come along and say, well, you know, I'm very certain that I'm gonna be far too busy next week to call in.
Mr. Mayor, Council, I would absolutely say that if you've taken time out of your day to sit on the phone and cast votes,
Yep.
you should be paid. That's positively what I would advocate for.
Good to do.
So we can.
Okay with that?
Make that happen.
Sure. Okay, then let's go on to, let's see. Well, we don't have a work session scheduled until January, so, I guess we can kind of.
No, we've got one scheduled for December 10th.
Yeah, but that's
But that one's already set.
already been filled, excuse me. We,
Oh,
you know, we always go 4 weeks in
Cheers.
advance, so, yeah. Any concerns about the agenda on the 10th?
Well, Mr. Mayor, I know that, Mike Schickish and that bunch kinda wanted to try to talk to us before the end of the year.
You know, that's a good point, Mike. I'm glad you brought
Maybe
that
we
up.
should, cause, and he had called me the other day about that again, and I'd like to get that on the agenda.
I thought
Isn't that the full
Oh, that's
Casper
for Casper
expansion?
I
expansion.
thought that was it.
They're on,
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay, never mind.
And I haven't called Mike back either.
Yeah.
Do you wanna call him and tell him that he is on?
Yeah, I suppose I could, or,
He and I have communicated via email, and he
does he know that that's on for?
He
the
does.
10th?
Oh,
Okay.
yeah.
Oh, okay.
does indeed. Yep.
And just by way of reminder to everyone, that's not necessarily an ask from them as, asking basically for our support of them engaging or getting started with a fundraising
Yeah.
effort of their.
I doubt if that will take 30 minutes, I don't know how long,
Yeah, it really shouldn't, you're right.
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, I would think 10. Would you guys agree?
That's good.
We don't need a whole slideshow on everything they would like to do. I don't think.
he will probably give at least a 10-minute discussion of what they want to do and show pictures and stuff.
Well, I think what he wants at this point is just a consensus blessing from the council for them to go forward with the fundraising effort. So,
That's consistent with what he told me.
yeah, I'd be amazed if it took more than 10 minutes.
Let's just make it 15 in case they want to talk a little more detail about the collection, the changes they'd like to see. I mean, it's their chance to talk a little bit about their passion, so. If it goes longer, it goes longer. Okay, anything, other concerns about the agenda for the 10th? Okay. Let's go around. Mr. Vice Mayor, anything to tell us about?
Nope.
Okay, Steve?
Had a meeting with Travel and Tourism, visit Casper. We had the discussion again. They're working in concert with CNFR to promote that better than what happened last year. Again, they've asked for, we put that $10,000 in last year to help market it. We were never charged with it. We were never asked to give any of that money to them, and none of it was spent. Visitors Bureau did spend money, but they never came back to anybody asking them to repay them. So again, this year they're asking that we would put that same amount of money back up to try and help market CNFR better than what it has been. Or look at different avenues to get more people in seats up there. So I guess that's my message to bring back. They're asking for that money and have our blessing to give it to them. And I think Brooke may have already reached out to you and talked to you about it.
tonight.
Yeah, I'm still a little concerned about our situation with the state insurance. And I'm not sure where we need to go with this, but one of the people on the committee made a, pretty derogatory statement about what we're trying to do. And that's not it at all. And then when you read the testimony that was written by Blue Cross Blue Shield, they're indicating that while expanding the pool makes the dollars more predictable, they neglected to mention the fact that that's the very reason that you have insurance, is to make the size of the pool bigger. And this was an insurance company saying this. And obviously they have a vested interest in seeing that there isn't a competitor to them. But I guess, is there something we should be doing other than write your congressman?
I think my opinion is lay low, because the closer this is attached to Casper, the more resistance we're probably gonna get.
But the smaller communities are the ones that would benefit the most.
Of course,
I mean,
of
that's-
course. But of course, we were brought up as the ones that were somehow gaming this process. If I'm correct on that, I mean that.
Mr. Mayor, Councilman Hopkins, I would absolutely say that that this would need to be an element of our legislative agenda that would propose to our legislators that indeed they push against this piece of legislation, because what this draft suggests is that cities and towns, as political subdivisions of the state, should not be able to participate in the pool that other political subdivisions of the state are allowed to participate in. So I think we need to push back against that. I think we need to advocate opposition to it. And where you have those opportunities to visit with your legislators, eyeball to eyeball, that, sometimes you do, please tell them they need to push back against that legislation. Because they do need 2/3 to make it happen.
That is our.
It's not gonna be easy to get it
It
down.
is not, or to even get it on the floor. I mean, it's not just that we are creations of the state. They created us. And so, for them to say that we're not governmental entities is.
Has WAM taken a position on that?
Yes.
They're advocating to other cities and towns.
But there's internal concern about that too, because it puts the WAM system potentially at risk, the JPIC system.
That's all I have.
So, Steve? Kristen?
Nothing tonight.
Ken?
The only thing is, this town hall paper was given to me, so I asked, for copies to be given to you guys, just to take a look at the concern that he has. So I hope you'll read it and just kind of hear what he has to say. Some of it I've said and we've discussed, but some of it I haven't ever brought up either. So I have no ties into it, just was asked to deliver it. The only other thing I have to say is to each one of you, I hope you have a happy Thanksgiving. If any of you are traveling, be safe. And to anybody watching or news media shares, I want to say council probably says happy Thanksgiving to everybody in Casper.
Well said. I've got a couple things I want to go over and just to be quick about it. Bob and I attended the Joint Powers Board meeting, when was that? Last week, right? Or 2 weeks ago. And Jared Stack is going to be resigning his position. There wasn't originally a plan to break off from the University of Wyoming, but I think they resolved some of their differences, and we will continue to have an innovation center that is operated by the University of Wyoming with some minor structural changes. CADA will no longer be called CADA, it will be called Advanced Casper. So I just want people to kind of get that in your mind so that when you hear that, you'll know what it is. One of the things they talked about was the results of the Startup Challenge. And this is something where the private businesses, because CADA is really a two-headed deal. There's the operational Advanced Casper that the city contributes, and then there's the group called Forward Casper, which is basically private companies that pool money that can be used for investment purposes. And so they do this startup challenge to basically take entrepreneurs with great ideas and score their ideas, and the top scorers then end up getting some funds from the Forward Casper group so that they can pursue creating this business. And there's some cool things. One of them is a business called Never Ride Alone that basically, if you want to go snowmobiling, you could sign on to this app and find somebody else that you don't know that's going snowmobiling to the same area or wants to hook up with you to go on a snowmobile trip. And so they believe that this has some future. There's another group in town that's actually manufacturing travel trailers that are designed for backwoods travel, and they're heavy duty, and you talk about diversification. This is a company that's doing very well, and our local economic development group is helping spur that activity, and a lot of these people will have, they've got a great business idea, but they don't know how to necessarily set up the company, get legal services set up, and do the whole business end of following through on things. There's another company called Refuel that's going to have a mobile fueling service that you can basically call in, and they'll go to wherever you are and sell you gas on site if you need it. And then there's a cocktail company that's called Piggyback Cocktail that's doing start to finish canned cocktails. So who knows what happens with any of these, but just, these are the things that we should know about and support, because these small businesses can really turn into something for us, and it's just great to see people kind of backing them. And there's this 307 Casper, which is maybe it's 307 Casper that's doing this, not Forward Casper, now that I think about it. But it's an investment fund where, again, people will kick in $100,000 to be part of this, and then the money is pooled, and then there's a board of directors that says, we believe that this is a group that can't get normal financing, but they have a good chance of success, and we're willing to take that risk even though a bank isn't. And then hopefully they get to the point where they can access more normal financing after this assistance. So pretty cool to hear about this stuff. Let's see, what else did I want to tell you all about? Disabilities Council met last week. This group is going forward. The attendance is great. They have 15, 18 people come to every meeting, and they are working to develop a disability awareness conference next spring, so that they can essentially educate the public about some of the challenges. Just the very reason we established this council, and then have booths, and just have a day where the community takes a look at people with disabilities and how we can be a more disability-friendly community and offer better support and services. Let's see, what else? I get these mailings. I never know quite what to do with them. This one is called Mayors and Businesses Driving Economic Growth that National League of Cities puts together. And it's part of the United States Conference of Mayors, and it's a best practices report. This is the stuff that other communities have done through trial and error that have worked. And it's good information. I just don't know how to disseminate it very well. So if you guys have any bright ideas about that, or if you're interested, I'd be happy to let somebody grab it and bring it back next time if they want to look at it. And I think you all got the 5-year plan for the housing authority, but I have a copy of it here. I think it was in one of our information packets. But I just kind of want to highlight that to show you again that our housing authority is doing great work in this community, and you're sitting on that board, Ken, and appreciate that. And they've the numbers just keep increasing as far as the stock of the housing and the quality of the housing, and they've set some goals for themselves. Well, I would just encourage you to go back into your packet, look at all this rather than have me go over all of it. But they're really working hard to connect more solidly with members of the community and trying to identify people that could benefit from subsidized housing. And then, of course, we know that there've been long waiting lists sometimes for that housing. If we can turn those over and get people out into market rate housing, those units become available, and they've had some real good success with that. So Ken, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, actually, if I could, something that's really cool is because they have done such a phenomenal job here in Casper, they have actually, who's ever over Lusk, has asked ours to adopt them and take over that and start working with, helping out Lusk from what it is to what we have done here. And I mean, the fact that the main group that asks it is asking ours just shows how well they are doing. I mean, it's phenomenal.
And just one more thing, going back to the Disability Council, I think that's been a real empowering thing for those folks to feel like they've got a voice, and and you can see relationships develop within the meeting. Maybe people didn't know each other before, because you can be pretty isolated out there. Related to that, I think you all noticed that we didn't score very high on the Equality Index again, and so we've been kind of wondering, well, what happened there? We thought we were doing a little better. One of the ideas that's been sort of kicked around along a similar vein would be to create another advisory council for the LGBTQ population in Casper. And so I wanted to get a sense of how council felt about that. It would probably be somewhat similar to the Disability Council, where there wouldn't be any funding associated with it from the city standpoint, but that the city would help organize the group and then maybe hear from the group whenever they thought it was appropriate. So anybody care to comment on whether they think that's a good idea or a bad idea? Not all at once, Ray?
Yeah, I think an advisory board is, I mean, I tried to go to I went to the Disabilities Council the other day, because just wanted to see it and go in and say hi and to some of the people I had known, and when I was mayor, I was at the beginning of that. So it really kind of gives a voice to be able to talk and be able to do that in the diversity of our community. And so I think it's a good idea. I'd support it. I think it's good for our community. I do agree that we did score low on that, for whatever reason that may be. But I think it's a good idea for us to be able to offer something like that in our community, at the very least. So,
other opinions? Kristen?
I would just say that I agree. I mean, this is an advisory council. We're not allocating funds to them. We're not giving them decisioning power. I mean, it's literally for them to feel like they have a voice and to advise us. It's not that we have to do whatever they ask us to do or do whatever they tell us to do. It's an advisory council.
Sean?
I'm okay with it. I'm just curious how they score cities and what criteria they use to score cities and why we're not scored higher, or why, I mean, it's just, I'm curious how that all, and what group is it that scores these cities?
It's a national group, and it's a, I can't remember the name of the group, but one of the things we don't have is an ordinance. They like to see an ordinance saying that it's illegal to discriminate based on housing and employment, just like it's illegal to discriminate racially, that it should be illegal to discriminate bisexual preference and gender identity. So, but then there's some other positions they want to see identified. I believe having an advisory council might improve our score. I don't know how much, but I mean, to me, it's the right thing to do. But it also has an economic development. You've heard my sermon about that before, and that how we are viewed by people outside of this community matters. So, Mike?
I kind of agree with what Sean just said, but also I wonder if there'd be any benefit to inviting some representative from them to come and talk to us and say, well, what is it that you're looking at? I read that thing in the paper. I didn't see any scoring criteria or anything in there. I'm sure that an ordinance and that kind of thing is on their checklist, but I'd kind of like to hear from them and say, well, are we doing something wrong, or what?
I know Jeremy's been in communication.
Absolutely.
With them. we're working on that. But it was disappointing, because I think, as I said in the paper, I think we're a much more welcoming community than we're
Yeah, I
given
just
credit
don't
for.
see how this even an issue. I don't see mass complaints of Casper being discriminatory, and to me, if it's not broken, don't fix it. Not to mention, again, like the tree ordinance, what's the city ordinance gonna do? Fine the business $750, and I think that's gonna do anything. I mean, it's just.
I'm not saying we should
Right.
pass an ordinance, you're asking what we didn't get scored
Right.
on, we don't have one, so I would be in favor of one, but I'm not gonna propose that unless there's a strong sentiment.
Mr. Mayor, if it pleases the council, we could absolutely put together a work session to where we discuss some of that scoring matrix, and maybe we would have some luck inviting one of their representatives out to participate in that conversation.
Or maybe a phone conference. I mean,
Absolutely.
it's a lot to ask somebody to come from DC or wherever they are to all the way out here to talk to us.
I'd rather
for a
just
half hour.
read how they score. I mean, they gotta have some kind of.
Well, they do have a,
They do.
Right.
Or even if they just send us their scoring matrix.
Right, that's all.
Well, we have that, don't we?
Mhm.
We have the actual scores, so, and I suppose we could put that in the packet.
You betcha.
Absolutely.
How about if we put it in the
Yes, we
packet,
could.
and then maybe the first work session in January, we go through this and say, you know, what do we need to do?
No, not for LGBT issues. Has to be specific.
Anyone else wanna weigh in on whether it would be a good idea to have an advisory council, cause we still gotta have, I guess, 5 to say, go forward, so.
I think it's a good idea.
Well, I'd prefer if we discuss that like in January and then decide on that. I think it's probably a pretty good idea.
Well, why would you, I'm just
What is-
curious, why would that affect whether we did it or not?
Well, now that you ask it that way, probably.
I would just as soon see what the criteria was for the score, because I think we're trying to cater to a special interest group. And I've said before that there are cases right now before the Supreme Court that should alleviate that whole deal, depending on, or acerbate it, depending on which side of the issue they come down on. And I would also tell people to look at the wall in our chamber in there. We had a gay gentleman as a mayor of this city. So we don't discriminate, we base things on the character of the person.
I'm not proposing
Yeah.
an ordinance, I'm just proposing an advisory council.
Well,
I'm not saying that we're trying to cater to anyone. What I'm looking at and thinking about is what kind of legitimate safeguards and protections and things can we and should we be providing to our citizens? And, that I could care less what people say about us, really, but if we're doing the right thing. And so that's why when you asked me the question that you asked, how would what these guys say affect whether we should have one of these advisory boards or not? When I thought about it that way, then I'm kind of like, no, yeah, let's go forward with the advisory board.
I mean, it's not gonna hurt, it doesn't cost money.
It'd just be, rather than have us speculate, let's hear from them.
Yep.
I think we had enough. Could we just see the thumbs again? Okay, I think we got enough to say, let's do a mayor's council on LGBTQ, and we'll just, put the word out that we're interested, and people can, much like they did before, put their names in, and then we will provide, a space for them here to meet, and, we'll probably have a staff person help assist with that, as we have with the Disability Council, and then they can determine their own agenda. And then at some point, they may want to speak with us. So, which I know the Disability Council is eventually gonna wanna do, although there's no urgency, first they're just trying to get themselves rolling. Okay, anything else for the good of the order? Echo Councilman Bates, happy Thanksgiving, everyone, safe travels, we're going down to Denver tomorrow. You got something, Carter?
Just real quickly.
Just a second, Carter's got one more thing, folks.
You might have seen it in my email to you this past week. I would like to give the employees an option to take one of the eves off.
Yep.
If that's okay with all of you, I'll see if we can make that happen. Okay.
Oh, one more thing, I'm sorry. Sorry about this. We have an opening at the Amico Rios Joint Powers Board, and in the past, we have arranged interviews where a subgroup of the council and a subgroup of the county commissioners would interview candidates, because it's a pretty critical appointment. And so we can do this however we choose to. What would you recommend, Carter? Because it wasn't the entire council and the entire commission, was it, when we did this before?
There were, I think there were 2 councilmen.
Okay. Is that how they did that? Everybody okay with doing, anybody care to volunteer to be on that interview board? Mike? Anybody else?
Being on the board, I would volunteer too.
Okay. All right. Okay, is that what we need to do then?
Yes, sir.
And then we'll figure out, we'll reach out to the commissioners and work out a time to do those interviews and get candidates. Steve?
And in answer to your question from possibly the week before, I don't think we need a sales pitch from the stormwater drain whatevers. I think that's something that staff ought to be able to handle quite well. And I think that does set a bad precedent if we start doing that.
Having businesses come in and try to sell to us, I agree.
Exactly right.
Fair enough.
I know that was in one of yours, and I had forgot to bring that up before, so.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mr. Mayor, Councilman Pacheco suggested that perhaps you might want to contact former Councilman Laird and tell him that Kayla is no longer going to be.
That was you, buddy. How'd you get me on it?
Thank you.
Congrats, Steve. Congrats, Chris.
That's what you got all that football.
Oh, yeah, I got this guy.